Okay, so good morning, everyone, and hope everybody has been able to manage okay with the snow. Hopefully, there'll be some melting today. And our Torah portion this week that we're going to look at is the portion Yitro. It's on page 436 in the Eitz Chaim, or whatever edition of Chumash you're looking at. Just look for Yitro, Exodus chapter 19. It's actually not page 436. It's actually page 432. I had it, I had it down at a different place in the Chumash. Sorry about that. So, yes, page 432, chapter 18, verse 1. Um, what I wanted to talk about today, first, the blessing for Torah study. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, shekidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. So the portion Yitro um, um, raises a question right away, in that who is this Yitro, and why is a Torah portion named for him? So Yitro, the very first verse of our portion, 432, again, chapter 18 of Exodus, verse 1, Vayishma Yitro, Chohen Midyan, Chotein Moshe, Et Kol Asher Asa Elohim LaMoshe. Uh, so Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses's father-in-law, heard all that God did for Moses and for Israel, his people, Ki hotzi Adonai et Yisrael mimitzrayim, that God brought out Israel from Egypt. That's the literal translation. So Yitro, the priest of Midian, was Moses's father-in-law. We were introduced to him earlier in the book of Exodus, when after Moses struck and killed the Egyptian taskmaster, Moses found out that people had seen that and heard about it, so he had to run away and ran to Midian. And if you can picture the map of the Middle East in your head and picture the Sinai Peninsula, Midian is the southern end of the Sinai Peninsula, what essentially around the town of Sharm el-Sheikh today. And even if you look at the map that's in the back of the Eitz Chaim, Midian is suggested to be across the Sinai from there in Saudi Arabia. It says Midian over there. How Moses would have gotten all the way to Midian from Egypt to run away, it makes more sense for it to be in the Sinai as opposed to all the way there on the bottom of in Saudi Arabia. But it's all a guesswork anyway from scholars as to where it was. Essentially, he ran far away and was welcomed in by Jethro at the time, and Moses ends up marrying with another love scene around the well, just like Eliezer, Abraham's chief servant, meets Rebekah at the well to bring back to Isaac, and Jacob met Rachel at a well. So too, Moses met the 7 daughters of Jethro at the well and marries one of them, Tzipporah. So here at the start of the portion, Yitro, page 432 in Eitz Chaim, chapter 18 of Exodus. So Yitro, it's noteworthy that of all the names of the portions, usually the names of the portions have to do with a noun or a verb that is in the first sentence of the portion. So like Bishalach, last week's portion, Bo, the portion before that, Va'era before that, or Shemot, the first portion of the book of Exodus, names either a verb, when he sent the Shalach, Bo, go to Va'era and I will be shown, or Shemot, names, verbs, or noun. Rarely is a portion named for a person. And the first portion that we have in the Torah named for a person is Noah, right? And Noah, you can argue, was not a Jew, not even an Israelite. He was a forefather of Abraham 10 generations before, but really not a significant Israelite. We have Sarah, Chaye Sarah, we have a portion. And so here with Yitro, it just is noteworthy for the rabbis that he merited having a portion named for him. I wanted to look at the commentary below the line here on page 432, just to get some initial thoughts about this portion. This parasha can be seen as the hinge of the Torah, as it says there in quotation marks, containing the pivotal event in the history of the Israelite people and indeed of all humanity. That is, we're going to see that in a little bit, the giving of the God's revelation at Mount Sinai, where the entire community heard God speak. Through the revelation at Sinai, Israel is transformed from a band of freed slaves to a nation covenanted to God. The parasha describes the moment when God reached down to reveal the Torah to humanity, or more specifically to the Israelites, that they might live by it and thereby reveal it to the rest of the world, right? So what's described is not just the 10 Commandments, but it's understood that the whole Torah was given by God to Moses and the people at Mount Sinai. The whole thought, though, about actually what the giving of the Torah means, giving by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, that raises a question which leads to the variety of denominations in Judaism. That whole the concept of God's revelation at Mount Sinai affects our understanding of what it means to be Jewish. That is, a Jew who observes the commandments. So are the commandments God-given, literally God-given? God spoke them to Moses at Mount Sinai? Or were they divinely inspired? Because that's another form of God-given, right? We can have an experience that seems as if God has spoken to us. And so therefore that experience becomes sacred, holy, and divine, even though literally God didn't speak. If we experience it as if God has spoken, that still is divine, but it's different from literally God speaking. And that gets to really understanding the Torah itself and the system of rabbinic Judaism, which is the interpretation of the Torah. We'll see for the beginning of chapter 19 a little bit more about that. But if we understand, traditionally, the rabbis understood that their interpretations come from Moses at Mount Sinai as well. And so if everything comes from Moses at Mount Sinai, that means then that things can't change, because who are we, human beings, to change God's word? So that, but if we think that the experience was divinely inspired, and perhaps the book itself, the Torah, and of course, rabbinic interpretation is all human based on a divine sacred book, then there's much more room to continue to interpret and continue to change. So that's why Orthodox Judaism today, which has this mantra of so-called Torah true, understands that law comes from God and it can't be changed, which is why in an Orthodox synagogue, men and women sit separately, women still are not counted in a minyan, etc., etc. Whereas in the conservative movement, Law is a continually evolving system. We have the right to continue to interpret, and therefore changes can be made to the system itself. All because we still, conservative Jews, see the system as divinely inspired, not literally God-given. Okay, so that's an important point that gets to this first phrase here, the hinge of the Torah, because it gets to an understanding of what it means to be a conservative Jew as opposed to an Orthodox Jew, as opposed to a Reconstructionist or a Reform or New Age or any other kind of Jew. Okay, so the commentary continues. A rabbinic tradition, as always, just feel free to unmute yourself if you have a question or a comment, or type it in the chat. A rabbinic tradition has it that God created the world so that Israel would emerge as a model nation, and all humanity would learn from their example. Another kind of reason why Mount Sinai is so important, because it serves to be a place where we can come out of it as an example to other nations. Had Israel not accepted the Torah, the universe would have ceased to exist. That's the Midrash, that the Torah was created before the world was created, but on condition that the people of Israel accept it. So the whole world would exist only if Israel accepted the Torah. So when they did, then the world can keep on going. So that's an interesting kind of understanding of why the world exists and what our place in the world is, that it's all interdependent. God created the universe. God created the forces of nature and the world as we see it around us. But God also created Torah to be the guide by which the world lives, and dependent upon the people of Israel, at least, leading their lives according to Torah. So the world can only exist if we, the Jewish people, follow the Torah. Right. Okay. So now to the comment about Jethro himself. So Jethro, Vayishma Yitro, Jethro heard. So even though the rest of the verse tells us what he heard, that everything that God did for Moses and Israel, his people, that he brought them out of the land of Egypt, before we get to the end of the sentence, there's still a question: what did Jethro hear? The sages understand, so I'm on the bottom left of 432, the sages understand that the Torah reports this event right after the encounter with Amalek, right? So if we put this in context, even though it's a new chapter, chapter 17 ended with the miraculous defeat of the Amalekites, where Moses had his arms held up by Aaron and Hur, and as long as his arms were raised, then the people of Israel were able to defeat the Amalekites. So that's how that portion ended, and now Jethro heard. So the sages understand that the Torah reports this event right after the encounter with Amalek to assure us that not all Gentiles are wicked enemies of Israel. All right, so that if we just have this from this immediate context, we have the Amalekites, who become the arch enemy of Israel, non-Israelites attacking. So that might instill in us a hatred of, or at least to be reticent towards, anybody who's not Jewish. So here comes a non-Jew, Jethro, who's a priest in his own tribe, and here he's treated well. Although there are Amaleks, there are also Jethros, and that's Ibn Ezra, a medieval Bible commentator from Spain, where in Muslim Spain there was a good relationship between Jews and Muslims. And so there, in that context, at that time in Spain, at a time when all people got along with each other and people were respected and Jews rose to high office within the Muslim court that ruled Spain at the time, you can have an attitude like Ibn Ezra's toward the non-Jews. Certainly there are bad people, there are bad apples all around, but just because there are some bad apples, don't say that the whole crop is bad. And Ibn Ezra and people at that time were able to see the difference. The name of Jethro is perpetually linked with the reading that includes the giving of the Decalogue. It's a fancy term for the Ten Commandments. We are a people who long remember the goodness of righteous Gentiles. What did Jethro hear that moved him? Right. So in other words, it's an important point the rabbis are saying, that we could have called this portion the Ten Commandments, or we just could have called it Vayishma, right? The first word is a verb. It follows the example, the precedent of having portions be called by the verb, the first verb in the line. Why isn't this portion called Vayishma? The rabbis went with the second word, Yitro, in order to say, hey, the Ten Commandments, they define who we are as Jews, but also remember that we live in the world with other people too, and that there are righteous people around who also can follow the Ten Commandments too. And then they go on. What did Jethro hear that moved him to associate himself with the people of Israel? Right? Some say, even though the rest of the line tells us he heard about the Exodus, some say he heard about their suffering in Egypt and was moved by pity. So what about it, the rabbis are asking, and the commentary is asking, what about Israel prompted Jethro to come forward to meet with the Israelite nation as soon as they came out, right? In other words, why aren't lots of people coming to meet the Israelites, right? Why is it that only Jethro heard what happened? Didn't everybody hear what happened? It should have been like in the New York Times of the day. Everybody should have heard what happened to Israel, and people should have come running and saying, "Oh, I want to be part of you and be part of what is clearly a blessed nation." So what about Israel moved Jethro to come forward? So perhaps he heard about their suffering and was moved by pity. Some say he heard of their triumph over Pharaoh's army and wanted to associate himself with a victorious people. That could be another thing too, right? Jump on the bandwagon as everything is going well. Others say he heard that the Israelites are on their way to rendezvous with God, that they were destined to be a special people, and he wanted to share in their destiny. In other words, he was converting from his Midianite religion to the Israelite religion because he had a revelation of his own that clearly the God of the Israelites is the God to be followed. Did not everyone hear what Jethro heard? Yes, but some people hear and do not really hear, right? We learn about it, but maybe it doesn't transform our lives. Okay, so for Jethro, that was a transformative experience to prompt him to become part of the Israelite nation. Okay, so then there is a question which I wanted to look at as well as the commentary continues. The verse says, Jethro, the priest of Midian, heard, the father-in-law of Moses, heard everything that God did for Moses and his people and Israel, his people. So the question is, why is Moses set aside and named separately from Israel? Why doesn't it say that Jethro heard everything that God did for the people of Israel? Why does it say Jethro heard everything that God did for Moses and the people of Israel? Why the extra for Moses? Could simply be because he's Moses's father-in-law, and maybe he's proud. Oh, look what my son-in-law has done. He made a name for himself, or he was chosen by God to do this. I'm a proud father-in-law, and perhaps that's why he's choosing him. singling him out. But the commentary says Moses is named separately because he experienced the Exodus differently than did the rest of the Israelites. For them, it was liberation for slavery. For Moses, it was an opportunity to serve God. So it's interesting because Moses grew up different from other Israelites, right? He grew up in Pharaoh's household, and if you go according to the movie The Ten Commandments that came out 60 years ago, or the cartoon movie that Steven Spielberg did, The Prince of Egypt, you have the story plays out about how Moses grew up in the household and becoming close to his half brother, who will be the next Pharaoh. So all of that's in Midrash because the Torah doesn't spend any time at all. Pharaoh's daughter finds him in the Nile, and and we're told he's raised in the palace. And the next thing we know, Moses is walking among his people, seeing the suffering of his fellow Israelites. So how old was he at that point? We don't know. The only age we're given is when it's time to get the Jews out. He's 80 years old. So from 0 to 80, we really don't know much about him. So, but he was not a slave. So liberation or the Exodus from Egypt is perceived differently. For the people, it's the immediate short-term actual freedom from slavery. For Moses, the Exodus is an opportunity to serve God. So it's an interesting Hasidic take on that. I wanted to move ahead, unless anybody has a question or comment first. I want to move ahead to chapter 19 now, what's listed as the fourth Aliyah, page 436. And a couple things that I want to highlight about this that are just fascinating, that have become really popular, important midrashim that we learn from the beginning of this chapter. So we're told about this encounter with Jethro, and how Jethro suggests to Moses how to ease the burden of listening to the people's troubles and cases, because Moses is the only person that people are coming to. And Jethro is suggesting a system of tens and hundreds and thousands of delegates over that different amount of people to help ease Moses's burden. Then we get to chapter 19, where we find the following. This is the intro to the revelation. B'chodesh hashlishi, in the third month, letzeit b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, the third month after the leaving of the people of Israel from the land of Egypt. Bayom hazeh, on this day, ba'u midbar Sinai, they came to the wilderness or the desert of Sinai. So a couple things that the commentary is going to bring forward, but one thing I can say right away is about the Hebrew, where it says in the second line there, Bayom hazeh. I said on this day. The English translation says on that very day. The English is wrong. The context, it's correct to say on that day, because when a narrator describes an event, the accepted way to do that is in the past tense, on that day. So here, the Hebrew, though, says on this day, and the English translation doesn't keep it on this day. But we have to, it should have said Bayom Hahu, on that day, Bayom Hahu. And we're familiar with the phrase Bayom Hahu from the song at the end of the service, Aleinu. V'ne'emar v'haya Adonai lemelech al kol haaretz Bayom Hahu, Bayom Hahu. On that day, God will be one, and his name will be one, right? So that's a prophecy for the future from the prophet Zechariah. On that day, the Lord will be one, and his name will be one. Not Bayom Hazeh. on this day, but Bayom Ahu, on that day. And that's just the way, the natural way to say it. So, of course, there's going to be something to say about Bayom Hazeh, on this day. Also, at the third month. So, again, for the Torah, counting the months is not the way the rabbis count the months and the way that we count the months in the year now. We count the first month of the year now is Tishrei, back in the fall when we have Rosh Hashanah. So that's considered the first month now. And for the past 2,000 years, that's the way Jews have been arranging the calendar. Yes, Jan, unmute yourself. Yes.
Wasn't there a time when Nisan was the first month?
Yeah, so that's why I'm getting to. So Nisan and the Torah, the year was based on agriculture and springtime. So Nisan was the first month of the year, or it's called Chodesh Ha'aviv, the month of spring. So Nisan was the first month. Iyar is the second month. Sivan is the third month. Okay. So the first month, let's say they left, I don't know, let's say based on this year's calendar, March 27th, Saturday night, is the first night of Passover. So they left in the first month on the 15th of the month on March 27th this year, which would mean Shavuot is May, I believe it's May 17th and 18th. So May 17th is the 6th of Sivan. So May 11th would be the first day of the third month, counting based on what the Torah is describing here. Okay, so it's really 2 months later, but it's in the third month. Okay, so that's how the Torah counts it. And the interesting thing also is how the rabbis understand the months. So before looking at the commentary below, we are familiar with signs of the zodiac. The rabbis were familiar with them as well. And we know that they were incorporated into symbols in synagogues. You look at the mosaic floors that have been found by archaeologists who have dug and uncovered synagogues from ancient times. So the oldest synagogue is from the 200s in northern Israel in Sipori. There's another beautiful mosaic floor in Beit Alpha, also in northern Israel. That's from the 400s. Both of those synagogues in Sipori and in Beit Alpha have beautiful signs of the zodiac on the floor of the main, what is the main prayer room of that synagogue that was uncovered. And so some might be appalled. What are signs of the zodiac, which is Greek and Roman, it's pagan kind of religious symbol. What do they have to do in the synagogue? And so clearly for the rabbis, it's not a problem at all to incorporate symbols from another culture and make them Jewish. And so when they're not buying into the astronomical system or into astrology, they're not saying that we lead our lives by astrology as some pagans did, right? They would look to the stars for a sign of what to do. Rather, for the rabbis, God created the stars in the sky and the patterns as we see them. And it's perfectly acceptable to take those signs of the zodiac and make them Jewish. So that's what the below the lines has for us right away on below the line on 436. That the first thing that this commentary in Eitz Chaim points out is the third month. The sages noting that the zodiacal sign for the third month, which is Sivan, is Gemini, the twins, take it as a symbolizing the equal importance of the written Torah and the oral Torah. So you take the twins, Gemini, whatever pagan or astrological non-Jewish symbolism behind it, make it Jewish. What about twins would have anything to do with the giving of the Torah? Why Torah given in a month that has the twins, Gemini, as the sign for it? Oh, so the rabbi said, what are the twin things that are important to us as rabbis deriving Jewish law? We need the written Torah. This, the 5 books of Moses, is the written Torah. And the oral Torah, everything the rabbis interpreted from the Torah and eventually wrote down in the Mishnah in 200 CE. And then 300 years later in the Gemara in 500 CE, they're saying that's the oral Torah, all rabbinic teachings that seem to stem from human beings themselves, the rabbis, in the rabbinical academy. They're saying no, they were inspired by God and revealed by God to Moses at Mount Sinai as well. There's lots of midrash that talk about Moses receiving the oral Torah. So in Hebrew, it's Torah shebichtav, the Torah in writing, which is the Torah scroll itself, the 5 books of Moses, and Torah shebe'al peh, the Torah that is by heart or by mouth, the oral Torah. So written Torah and oral Torah. So oral Torah is the Mishnah and the Gemara. And there's a famous midrash of Moses wanting to know how this Torah is going to be taught in the future. So God takes Moses and puts him into a rabbinical academy with Rabbi Akiva teaching a class. Moses has no idea what they're studying, even though it's Jewish law. He has no idea what they're studying. He's lost in class. It's fascinating that rabbis would dare to write such a midrash that would put Moses in such bad light. How could Moses, the one and only Moses, the prophet of all prophets, not understand what's being taught in Rabbi Akiva's class? But they're willing to do that to Moses because he says he's comforted at the end of the class when Akiva says, everything we taught here today is from Moses at Mount Sinai. And that comforts Moses that 1,200 years after his time on Mount Sinai, Torah was being taught in that way. But the purpose for that midrash is for the rabbis to further emphasize that what they're teaching isn't new. What they're teaching is actually old, and they are just bringing it back again, recovering it, and teaching it to the people. It's a clever system that the rabbis came up with to provide them the authority for the Jewish community at the time to say that why should the Jewish community 2,000 years ago listen to the rabbis as the new form of Judaism? Because the rabbis are saying what we're teaching isn't new, it's from Moses at Mount Sinai. Okay, so they perpetuate this myth, and I'm willing to put it that way because we just have to understand and accept, at least as conservative Jews, we have to understand and accept that the role of the rabbis 2,000 years ago was significant and important and invaluable. Were it not for the rabbis, we would not be here today as a Jewish people. The only way for the Jewish community to survive was with a system that was independent of the temple in Jerusalem. If our religion was only based on bringing sacrifices to the temple and there was no other alternative in place, we would have disappeared from the face of the earth as a Jewish people. And so because of the rabbis, we survived. So I am happy to accept the idea that the rabbis created or innovated a system that allowed Judaism to be portable and allowed Judaism to evolve. And that if we can accept that Judaism as we observe it today is a continually evolving system, that's exactly what conservative Judaism teaches. It is inspired by God. We base it on a sacred text. We're not basing it on like the American Constitution. For some in America, that's considered a sacred text, but it's not sacred in that it's not God-given, right? It's the foundational principle on which American society is based, important document for the basis of American civics today, absolutely. but you can't argue that the Constitution is sacred because people wrote it. You can argue that the Torah is sacred. You could argue that the Mishnah and the Gemara, the Talmud, are sacred because you're basing it on words that provide a religious lifestyle. The Constitution of America provides a civic lifestyle, but has nothing to do with religion. Not supposed to have anything to do with religion. The Torah and Judaism itself is a religious lifestyle, and therefore the text on which we base everything on is a sacred text. But law, as we interpret, is continually evolving. And that's the only way I see that law makes sense. It doesn't make sense to observe law today the way it was observed 200 years ago. It's just impossible because society and technology changes. There's no way that we can, when we develop new technologies and new ways to look at the world around us, that a system as written 200 years ago, for example, could provide the exact framework for how to live our lives today. It provides a framework for how to interpret, to continue to evolve it, to understand. So, for example, for a very mundane example, when the rabbis say that we're not supposed to travel on Shabbat, their systems of travel that they had in place all involved work and exertion. You can't walk more than 3,500 feet outside of city limits, because anything more than that, you're going to start getting tired, and it's just not appropriate for Shabbat. You can't saddle an animal because that causes the animal to work. And so those are the only modes of transportation: your own 2 feet or an animal or a ship. Okay, so you can't get on a ship. You can't walk more than 3,500 feet beyond city limits. You can't saddle your animal because all of that is work. So how does that apply in a time when there are cars? And how does that apply in a time when society has become overpopulated and people aren't living within a village anymore? So the interpretation of, so the understanding of travel has to be reinterpreted. And so that's why the conservative movement had allowed 60 years ago turning on an engine in a car and driving to synagogue, and not seeing that as traveling, but not a violation of Shabbat. That's just one of many, many such examples in which something that's said in the Torah becomes reinterpreted today. So all of that oral Torah, we are the next generation to take on the mantle of the oral Torah and continue to study and to interpret. So I see the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards as the place to go to for the conservative movement to understand the intricacies of Jewish law today. But it's also understood that I, as an ordained rabbi of the conservative movement, I have the right to be able to interpret law myself. I don't need the conservative movement's law committee to base decisions on. I can make my own decisions. I prefer, though, not to make my own decisions. I prefer instead to base my decisions on the law committee, people who are more well-versed in Talmudic law than I am and have studied issues much more than I have. So, for example, when I became the rabbi of Sharei Tefillah 26 years ago, the issue on the table at the time was to make Sharei Tefillah egalitarian in religious practice. And I based our policy then that was accepted based on decisions of the law committee. I didn't make up my own understanding of egalitarian practice. It was based on the law committee itself. Okay, so all of that is just an explanation of not just the use of the zodiacal sign for Midrash, but also an understanding of the written Torah and the oral Torah. So why is the Torah given in the third month and not the second month and not the fourth month? Specifically because of Gemini, in order to teach us the pillars of Judaism, the twin pillars of Judaism, written Torah and oral Torah. According to another interpretation, why Gemini, this teaches us that should Jacob's twin brother Esau change his wicked ways and come to accept the Torah, he would be welcome. So that's a fascinating midrash too. If the zodiacal sign Gemini is going to be a source for why the third month of the calendar is the time for giving of the Torah, what's so good about it? We can welcome back people into the fold who have left for various nefarious reasons. So that's interesting that the rabbis would come up with such a midrash that the door is still open for people who have left the fold to come back, and we'll welcome them in. And just as Jacob's twin was brought up in the same way that Jacob was, and he left, he can come back. So too others who have left can come back. Okay, so then the commentary goes on. We may find it strange that the sages refer to the signs of the zodiac. They were often used in synagogue decorations for homiletic purposes and possibly in poetry as well. Like you find traces of it in Genesis 49. For example, Libra, the scales, is the sign for the high holiday season, right? The scales of justice, and Libra is around the time of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So it just works out. The sign of the zodiac are never used by the sages to predict the future, nor do the sages attribute to them any power to shape people's destiny, right? So that's why I had said before, the signs are interesting to teach lessons, but we don't lead our lives by the signs. Why was the Torah? So now it goes on to a different subject about why the Torah was given in the third month and not right there in the first month as soon as they got out of Egypt and crossed the sea. Why was the Torah not given as soon as the Israelites left Egypt? The Midrash compares the situation to that of a child who had fallen gravely ill. His father gave him several weeks to recuperate, and only then did he let him return to school. So too, when Israel went out of Egypt, some Israelites had been disabled by the experience of slavery. God said, I'll wait until they're healed, and then I'll give them the Torah. So there's that idea from one collection of Midrash known as Tanhuma, that people just had to recover from the experience of slavery, and they just weren't physically and emotionally ready to receive something as important and to experience something as remarkable as God's revelation. Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev sees it slightly differently. Had Israel received the Torah immediately after the Exodus and the parting of the sea, it would have seemed that they accepted it out of gratitude for the miracles God had wrought for them. Instead, God waited until the effect of the miracles had worn off, and they began to complain. Then their acceptance of the Torah was a completely voluntary act of commitment, right? So we have a number of complaints after the crossing of the sea until this point, right? They first had to fight the Amalekites. Then they were complaining about no food, and they were complaining about no water. So they're just becoming regular people again. And that's based on this Hasidic commentary, that's when it's better to accept it rather than in a moment of exhilaration. Okay, so now we get to the meaning of the Bayom Hazeh. Why the Hebrew, the unusual Hebrew here? Why isn't it Bayom Hahu? Why did the Torah specifically say Bayom Hazeh, which means present tense, on this day? So when you're going in the narrative, in the third month, in the third month after the Israelites left Egypt, on this day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. So, in other words, if it was consistent in Hebrew, it should be Bayom Hazeh Ba'im Midbar Sinai. On this day, they are coming into the desert of Sinai. Yes, Jen, unmute yourself.
So is this where it kind of comes from, like we were all at Sinai, because it's
Yeah,
kind of in
yeah,
present tense, and then
you're
the
reading ahead,
Passover
and
piece?
you could teach the class.
Oh,
So
I'm
it's
sorry.
no,
I'll be
it's okay.
quiet.
No, not at all. But it's that's what the Midrash says right here below the line. The Hebrew here literally means on this day, as if to suggest that on any day when a Jew accepts the obligations of the Torah, it's as if he or she were there that day, standing at Sinai and hearing the voice of God, right? So even at this moment, as we are learning together this week's portion, that it could be that that's what this day means. That as any day that we're learning something Jewish is a day that resembles what the Mount Sinai experience was like. So Rashi, the commentary goes on, Rashi takes the words to mean that every time a Jew reads the Torah, it should be as if for the first time. Okay, so not just when we study Torah, but Rashi is suggesting when we read from the Torah. So that could be the public reading of the Torah, maybe he's referring to. So that shouldn't be, so I look at Paul or myself who are regular Torah readers and kind of know a lot of the Torah kind of by heart with the appropriate trup. We might take it for granted that we know it and not put any thought into it. And what Rashi is suggesting, no, we shouldn't do that. We should use the skills that we have and be happy about it and make it seem as if it's the first time we're ever reading from the Torah. Heschel distinguishes between the giving of the Torah, which was a one-time event in the Sinai wilderness, and the acceptance of the Torah as an authoritative voice in our lives, which can take place at any time. So there's the one-time receiving, and then there's the ongoing accepting. When a person of non-Jewish origin joins the Jewish people and accepts the Torah, it's as if he or she personally had been standing at Sinai. So the other thing that the present tense does is for people who convert to Judaism, who didn't have the ancestral experience of having been at Mount Sinai, the present tense of Bayom Hazeh makes it as if a person converting to Judaism was at Mount Sinai too. So by converting to Judaism, the convert automatically becomes part of the historical experience, and all of history enters into the psyche of the convert on the day that they convert to Judaism. So there's that beautiful element as well. So the on this day highlights these very different, all very positive spiritual and religious approaches to understanding Torah in our lives and God in our lives today. And there's one other note that I just wanted to add to this, which is also based on some unusual Hebrew. It's the second sentence in the portion. Vayisu merefidim, they traveled from Rephidim. Vayavo'u midbar Sinai, and they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Vayachanu bamidbar, and they camped in the wilderness. Vayichan sham Yisrael neged ahar, and Israel camped in front of the mountain. The English again hides a problem in the Hebrew. So, because we have to remember that Hebrew is person sensitive, it's gender sensitive, and it's so in other words, you can get away in talking second person. Like when I'm talking to you, I could be talking to one of you, or I could be talking to all of you. How I talk to you is the same, but in Hebrew, it wouldn't be. In Hebrew, there's a difference between the singular, first, second, third person singular versus first, second, third person plural. So I versus we, you singular, you plural, or he, she, or they. And the word, the verb, reflects whether it's singular or plural. Whereas in English, it doesn't always do that. I did this, we did this. Did is still the same. You did, you did. He did, they did, right? So the did is the same no matter whether it's first, second, third person, singular, or plural. But in Hebrew, it's very different for each one. So the point is, the verse says, Vayachanu, they camped in the wilderness. Vayichan, he camped there in front of the mountain. Okay, so the Hebrew itself, just two words apart, it should have said Vayachanu Sham Yisrael Neged Ahar. So they camped, Israel, they camped in front of the mountain. Why the singular person? Okay, so now it could be, and sometimes in English versus American English. Usually when you talk about I don't know, the police, I don't know, when it's talking about a corporate group of something, as somehow in British English, it's referred to differently than American English. And I can't think of the exact example of that, but I think you know what I'm talking about. But here in American English, you say Israel camped there. So why the difference between they and he for the camping? So there's a comment below the line on 437. Until now, all the verbs referring to Israel have been plural. They journeyed, they entered. Here, for the first time, the Hebrew verb for encamped is singular, suggesting that only when they transcended their differences and quarrels to become one people were they fit to receive the Torah. All right, so that's the important midrash commentary that Rashi and the rabbis bring about this. What's the singular word mean? Vayichan. It means that they were all united in their spiritual approach and readiness to accept Torah, accept God's word at Mount Sinai. Okay, so that's all we have time for today. We'll stop here for today. And any questions or comments or thoughts about this? Okay, so I wish everybody continued safety and health. Looking forward to seeing everyone next Wednesday. We have Minyan tonight at 7:30. We have coffee hour tomorrow at 10. And this Friday night, remember, we're combined with Beth Shalom in Columbia. So different Zoom link or a different live stream link for the service this coming Friday night. So have a good rest of the day, everybody.
Stay warm.
Thank you.
One, two.
Thank you, Rabbi. Bye-bye.
Enjoy your snow.
Yes, Mr. Florida there, Sumner.